Hello, thanks for joining us for BookBound 2020, a From Home Literary Festival. My name is Romesh Gunesekera, and I'm here to host a discussion between the authors Jennifer Wong and Soniah Kamal. The event has been curated in partnership with Wasafiri magazine to raise money for the UK-based mental health charity Mind. Mind provides advice and support to empower people experiencing mental health problems. Their statistics show that on average, 1 in 4 people will experience a mental health problem in a typical year. And 2020 is not a typical year. So please make your donation to support Mind using the link to the BookBound Just Giving page displayed below. You can find out more about BookBound, Wasafiri, Mind, and our authors by visiting our website, bookbound2020.co.uk. So now to our event. I know Jennifer Wong and Soniah Kamal are there. You haven't met each other before. You know a little bit about each other. But let me say, for the benefit of the people who are eavesdropping on our conversation, just a couple of lines. So Jennifer Wong is a poet whose book, Letters Home, has been named the PBS Wildcard Choice by Poetry Book Society. Lovely book of poems exploring the complexities of history, migration, translation, things that we're going to be talking about a lot, I think, over the next 45 minutes or so. Soniah Kamal is award-winning novelist. Her first book, An Isolated Incident, was a finalist for the Townsend Prize for Fiction. And her next book, Unmarriageable, which takes Pride and Prejudice to Pakistan, is a Financial Times Reader's Best Book for 2019. And also NPR Code Switch in New York Public Library's summer pick last year. She knows everything you could possibly want to know about Jane Austen. Welcome to both of you. It's great to have you here. This is really an unusual kind of event. Even more unusual now because I can't actually see both of you at the same time. So let's see how it goes. But you both lived in different countries and your writing explores different parts of the world. So relocation, I guess, is a kind of significant part of your experience. So let's start with you, Jenny, to just get this conversation going. You've spoken a lot about Hong Kong, where you grew up, your hometown, as it were. But your writing life now is in Britain. Can you say something about the journey you've been on between those two?
The journey between Hong Kong and England.
Yeah, for you and for your writing.
I suppose, for me, it has always been. I always find myself straddling between cultures. It's not. I used to feel really alienated from a place because, for example, I grew up in Hong Kong and then I went to England to study. And back then I chose literature, which my teachers all urged me against because they thought it wouldn't be a very I wouldn't be able to handle that. But on the other hand, I think being away from a place actually helps you to think of home much better and much more clearer. And I think when I was when I live in England all these years, I miss Hong Kong, or I am able to kind of connect back to Hong Kong again and again in a different way. I went back to Hong Kong actually after my undergraduate studies and worked there for a few years as well. And so for me, it's always like this constant journeying back and forth that matters to me. So now I've lived in England for quite a long time now.
Your long poem, Mountain City, that kind of takes us on a journey from Hong Kong to Oxford, isn't it? Can you say something about how you came to write that and the process there?
Yeah, that Mountain City poem has been quite a long time in making because I started it back in 2012 when I was in Hong Kong doing a writer residency in Lingnan. And back then it was like just a matter of like lots of fragments and scribbling in the notebook about things that I really care about in Hong Kong, and being able to spend 3 months there teaching makes me kind of all these images and memories sort of collide together and felt really real. And then also it's simply a matter of also putting together stories from other people that in my community, whether they be high school friends, university friends, and people whom I used to work together as colleagues in government, trying to piece together all these things that matter, and or maybe like also things that I feel have already changed. So I suppose like I like this fragmentary form because it allows me more freedom to kind of put together a collage of memories.
So did you start writing it while you were there and then
Yes,
finish it when you were in Oxford, as it were?
yeah. So I finished it when I was well, simply the Mountain City has been growing all these years, that poem, and I didn't stop changing it until I really have to print out this book. So
Right.
that's
Okay, so that's it takes in a
reason.
lot of things. Yeah. Sonia, maybe if you could bring you into the conversation, looking at your biography, it seems that there's almost nowhere you haven't lived, really. I thought I lived in a lot of different places, but you lived almost everywhere, I think. Isolated Incident, which is going to be republished here in the UK very soon, I think, has lots of has some significant, important, big journeys in them. You have your characters who move from Kashmir to America, from America to Afghanistan, and it's the Kashmir of your grandfather, a place that you've made your own, I guess, in some way. Can you tell us a little bit about that journey?
Sure. Thank you, Romesh, and thank you, BookBound and Wasafiri for holding this wonderful virtual online festival. I have lived in a lot of places, and really the interesting thing is often not by choice. I mean, when you're a child, you go where your parents take you. You know, you're told whether you like your school, you like your community, you like everything. One day you're told, well, we're moving and you have to go along with that, whether you want to or not. So a lot of that, you know, so coming with a lot of my movings has been the sense also of not having the agency to decide whether I want to stay or not stay. So for me, moving also comes together with the triptych I like to call location, dislocation, and then relocation, of not just me in geographical space, but also that geographical space in me. And you know, I often wonder how much geography plays into who we become. I mean, we like to think that we're born and we have, I mean, we are born, not that we like to think we are born, but that we're born into a certain culture which stays with us forever, and that culture belongs to us. But having moved so much, I mean, I was born in Karachi, Pakistan, and then at 6 months of age, my parents moved us to England. And then at 9 years of age, I moved to Saudi Arabia. Then from there, we went back to Pakistan, where I did my high school, and then I came out to college in the US, and then I happened to meet my husband by absolute fluke and stayed on in the US, and then moved to so many different states, from West Coast to East Coast to Midwest to California and I'm currently in the South, in what I used to call, before I came to Atlanta, Georgia, Margaret Mitchell country, but now it's also called home. So, you know, with so many relocations and having to place myself in them, it can, you know, on the one hand, it can be fragmentary and very nomadic, but on the other hand, I mean, the whole concept of roots versus rootlessness, how do you make roots in a place? What roots are allowed you in a place? What roots do you take by choice? What roots do you forcefully sow somewhere? And I think all this stuff definitely plays out in An Isolated Incident, which is coming out with Allison and Busby in July, I believe. It was originally written because my grandfather, who was a refugee from Indian administered, occupied Kashmir, in 1948, he went to Pakistan, administered, occupied Kashmir. And I saw growing up, his elder daughters remained in that one part, you know, there was a border, and they couldn't visit when they wanted. So I really saw the dislocations, the displacements, and not just the displacements of physical geography, but also emotional geography. There was a lot of displacement of not being able to visit when you want, not being able to, when my grandfather was on his deathbed, literally what should have taken my elder two aunts who were married in Kashmir, settled there, literally 2-3 hours. They should have, you know, come in from Srinagar, Delhi, Lahore. My hometown in Pakistan is Lahore. It took them 2 days because visas were not difficult to get, and there were no flights between the two countries, so they had to come via Dubai, and they actually missed seeing him. They by hours, they came to his funeral rather than being able to say goodbye. So things like this are very much part of what went into making An Isolated Incident, which starts off with a very horrific event that happens to one of the main protagonists, Zari. She's 19 years old. She in a very brutal catastrophe loses her family, all of her family, extended, her fiance, as well as herself. And the novel is very much a quest to discover that, you know, most of us at the end of the day, I mean, the situation we're sitting in right now also with the pandemic, you know, it's the family we're looking to, relying on. When you have lost your entire family in civil conflicts, in you know, through natural disasters, what then allows you to go on living life? That those internal displacements, those geographical roots, which are oftentimes our family, our memory, how we, you know, who we see ourselves as, what happens to that in times of conflict, whether they're natural, whether they're man-made. And you know, and I followed in An Isolated Incident, it takes us from both the Kashmirs in both the countries to she comes to the US. In the US, she goes to a very, very far-flung relative's house who has a very idealistic 19-year-old son who has grown up in the Spider-Man, Rambo, you know, Superman culture where you're invincible, you can go out and save the world. And, you know, he finds out, like a lot of kids, even who join the army, find out that it's not as simple. When you're on the front, when you're on the battlefront, you're not just confronted physically, once again, geographical position and physically with what you hope to defeat, but also your internal demons, you know, your internal displacement, your internal geography does a tectonic shift also, and you start to see things in a different light. So An Isolated Incident is very much about that. And Unmarriageable, which is like you said, it's a parallel retelling of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, and it's set in Pakistan. Growing up in a, you know, post-colonial.
Actually, before we get on to Unmarriageable, because I have a
Yes.
question about that particularly,
Sure.
but there's one I wanted to ask. I mean, in An Isolated Incident,
Yes.
Billy and Zari have a big argument at one point about Kashmir and who has the more authentic connection with it.
Yes.
And I was just wondering, do you have this tussle yourself, or how does that work? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yes, you know, I have often seen this particular, the conversation is really, Billy is an immigrant child whose roots are in Kashmir through having visited and his grandparents, and very much what immigrant children go through. Zari, on the other hand, is born, brought up, bred there, and has been forcefully uprooted into this new place where she is now, for all intents and purposes, an immigrant. And the argument between them is, who does Kashmir really belong to? By dint of who does this tragedy belong to? Billy has a history with his grandfather, whom he really doesn't know about, and he's trying to find more about. And he feels a connection to Kashmir, or by dint of Kashmir, this land, to geography, to memory, to history, by way of the memories he has of his grandfather and and the other relatives he has there. Zaria, her memories are concrete. She has lived there. She's been brought up there. She knows the smell, she knows the seasons, she knows the language, you know. So their argument very much is, whose Kashmir is it? Whose memory is not so much authentic per se, but who has more claim to geography, who has more claim to memories, whose hurt is more. And this is of course a conversation that is very specific to these two characters and the events that the novel presents to them, and that they go through emotionally. But you know, I've seen this particular conversation played out, if not verbally, oftentimes in very interesting ways throughout my life. You know, I have an essay at the end of an isolated incident called Kashmir Calling. And I can understand Kashmiri because I grew up with my grandparents and my mother who all spoke Kashmiri, but I'm not able to speak it. So, you know, so on the one hand, in some way, I lay some linguistic claim to that language. But when I have my cousins who have grown up in Kashmir and they're like, you can't speak the language. Yeah, but I can understand it. So, you know, little things like that, you know, and just for identity purposes, it's always fascinated me how identity plays out, who it plays out for, whose identity is stronger, whose identity is weaker. And I think these are very valid questions. In the first instance, we all want to believe that we have equal identity status in many respects. But you know, when you're confronted with someone who perhaps is laying a greater claim, and it forces you to think about your own claims. So that particular conversation in the novel does come out, you know, it plays out like this. And it's a conversation that comes up for a lot of immigrant kids, or even, you know, even people who may find themselves on a land longer than some immigrants. But nevertheless, who does that land, who does that country, who does the identity passport belong to? Yeah.
The sense of belonging, yeah. Actually, Jenny, I wanted to ask you about language as well, actually, because Sonia, we're talking about language and how that affects identity and the stories we tell about places as well. And the link between place and language, I think, is interesting. And Jenny, you use language really interestingly, and use languages in the plural interestingly. And you bring in Chinese characters, I mean the language, you know, the words into your poems. And they seem almost like places in the poems, the characters. And Jenny, you obviously give us the translations at the end of the book as notes, but can you say something about how you navigate that, and how you want your readers to navigate in the poems?
Yeah, like Sonia has you know, like made a lot of reference to identity and language and also cultures, and which I really agree as well. And I think for me, while sharing similar sentiments, I also feel that there is some specificity to do with Chinese language that when I grew up, or when I go from place to place, I live in different places, that sort of social, cultural, as well as political sort of connotations of the language versus English matter to me quite a lot, and it sort of define and keep redefining us as individuals. For example, like when I was living in Hong Kong, I speak both Mandarin and Cantonese. Cantonese being a more native language, mother tongue, so as to speak. And whereas Mandarin, I know it quite well through my because my grandmother spoke only in Mandarin, and so and of course we got to learn also Mandarin. We took Mandarin classes, and alongside speaking to friends in Cantonese. And I think that sort of linguistic backgrounds of growing up there makes you kind of feel the sort of meanings or significance of each language being different. And constantly we feel like, for example, Cantonese is very much embedded in all our growing up, like all these memories and so on, and it means home to me. So that's why I added in quite a lot of Cantonese in my poems, including even in Mountain City, the epigraph starts with a Cantonese version of TV news, like reporting on the, kind of like an opera house being threatened to be being demolished. Whereas Mandarin becomes a language that I feel very fond of. I really love the sound, but to me, there is also a sense of foreignness in Mandarin itself, because I was growing up, I didn't grow up in China. But on the other hand, I think Mandarin gives us like all these connotations of like, because it is the written language. So for me, that is also familiar in that sense, as in I access all this literature through a more kind of written form of Chinese. So for me, like I constantly feel that I have to navigate the meanings, and sort of like, to me, all these language, be it Cantonese or Mandarin, traditional or simplified characters, they all have their convergences and divergences, which I explore sort of in some of my poems. Like sometimes I mix them up, like say from girls from my class, I like to use, like, for example, TV shows, I will try to put it together in Chinese characters, because there is like a certain sort of endearment seeing that characters, let's say, like a very popular TV program for young people, and yeah, there's a certain sense of familiarity. That I remember there's a Hungarian philosopher, Keller, who says that home is where no footnotes are needed, and I think
that sounds great.
This is what really makes it different. Like how you find like every tiniest bit of memory being quite important to you. And for example, in terms of, like, for example, even the Chinese language itself, in terms of grammar, for instance, for a while I was teaching Chinese when I was doing my PhD. I taught some Chinese classes on the side, and I find it fascinating to see how foreigners come to appreciate, or what are their questions about the grammar of Chinese language, and the differences actually intrigue me. And I feel like this sense of, in Chinese language, the sense of constantly having the past, because we're quite bad at denoting tenses. Like in Chinese language, there's not so much the engagement with tenses so much. And I feel like this sense of the past constantly lurking around kind of find my way in some of my poems in a cultural as well as linguistic way.
It sounds like the more one moves around, the more important the stability that the language kind of provides, whichever language you're writing in, whatever. Do you also feel that, Sonia? As you and particularly, I suppose, in your case, Sonia, when you're kind of exploring a story that seems so rooted in a place, and then you place it in another. I'm thinking of the Jane Austen story, and you then transfer it to another place. And it seems in one way, the place is so important to the story, and in another way, it's not at all important. What's going on there?
That's an interesting paradoxical way to look at it, actually. And I would say, honestly, in some respects, I feel that home is the place where you get to make the footnotes, write your own footnotes, choose them. And by dint of that, the footnotes with unmarriageable would be both one where the geographical location is vital, but for reasons of history and memory. And the reason I wrote the novel the way it is, which is a parallel retelling. So I literally took Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice and reset it in Pakistan. So the plot is unchanged, all the characters are there. So it wasn't an inspiration, it's not a sequel, it's not a, you know, it's very much Pride and Prejudice written there. And I did that with colonization, British Empire, and being in Pakistan being what is called a post-colonial country in mind. You know, obviously, as we know, British Empire came. Babington Macaulay, one of my epigraphs in 1835, gave his speech to Parliament where he suggested that the English language should replace, you know, indigenous and native languages, which is what ended up happening with empire. So English became the language of opportunity, privilege, advancement in many respects, as well as supposedly superior culture, better breeding, all that sort of nonsense that goes on with, you know, reframing identity when colonizers do it. And, you know, so for me, I have grown up in the English medium system in Pakistan. English is a Pakistani language because in 1947, when the subcontinent, you know, became two countries, Pakistan took English as one of its official languages. So, you know, people sometimes say, oh, the language of the other and stuff is not the language of the other, because it's an official language, it is a Pakistani language. So for me, the language was not what was really at play geographically as much as it was seeing the culture, you know, growing up with the British canon, with Western literature. I very quickly adapted to seeing myself within the stories of a geography in which I didn't live per se, or even a time period which I didn't live, which is what Austen's was, Regency England. But, you know, very quickly I started shifting anything I read, even if it was American, you know, young adult literature like Judy Blume's Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret. Very quickly, New Jersey became Lahore. You know, bonnets became dupatta. So I just naturally started seeing the universalities in that. But for me, writing Unmarriageable was very much a post-colonial project. I mean, it's a novel, it's entertaining, it's funny, but it has its serious themes of the way it is written is because it's something I would have liked to have read growing up. Sure, I would have liked to have read Jane Austen, and I did, but I would have liked to have something that was written in English, the language I grew up in, but set in Pakistan, which was the culture I grew up in. But when I was growing up, there was nothing of the sort, let alone something that was seen as classic, you know, that was enduring and universal. But back to what you said, which is, yes, place is very important because I took it from the Regency, from Western canon into Pakistani canon, and South Asian canon, really. I mean, readers from Bangladesh, from Nepal, Sri Lanka even, you know, India, they're all like, you know, and they'll send me messages saying, we didn't realize actually how similar the culture is, which is fascinating because linguistic differences, food, everything, and yet there's something universal there, which once again harkens back to Austen also, you know. Yes, it may, you know, there is a universal thread in human emotions, human stories. And I think especially with Pride and Prejudice, it is a story about a mother who is desperate to see her 5 daughters married and married well. And I would challenge any culture to tell me where this story does not resonate with them on some level.
In a sense, that is why we read novels, because you do, in a sense, rearrange it to fit into your world.
You do,
but
you know, I will just say there that when you are a post-colonial child, or the way history has played out, it's often children of a certain time period, color, history, memory, who are reading the Western canon or literature of a certain thing. So with Unmarriageable, what I wanted to do was very much have a mirror image going on, where readers who might not necessarily pick up a Pakistani novel or something set in a different culture would pick something up which is so familiar to them, which is so home and footnotes to them, and suddenly see it through a different prism, different culture, and for the first time perhaps have a window into how I've grown up, and many of us have grown up, which is seeing ourselves in different geographies, different foods, and being able to connect. So there was that wish going on for me too.
Yeah, so with that sort of geography, and Jenny, this applies to you as well, actually. I mean, how do you individually, I suppose, set about evoking that place, that specific place and time? What are the things you do? I mean, do you go on experience? Do you do research? Sonia, you have a chapter in Afghanistan when Billy goes. Oh, I won't say. I won't tell you say the story, but there's a training camp in Afghanistan. So are these things imaginative? How do you make these decisions for both of you, really, in terms of evoking place?
For me,
So,
yeah, go on, Jenny.
In terms of like storytelling, I think in a way poetry especially, like it is a way of like finding a way of placemaking in terms of stories. So you have to build a narrative of some sort in order to really like go back to the sort of precision of a place. Because even though that, for example, I have lived in Hong Kong or I've lived in England for a number of years, it doesn't mean that these imageries come automatically to me. So I think it's a matter of research and a matter of reinventing a place or trying to retell a place with some sense of imagination. So I would say like fact and fiction, they are intertwined. I wouldn't be able to, although people think that maybe the book is somewhat autobiographical, but there are also places where imagination happens and you have to use all these connections between places. So for example, I have a poem from Beckenham to Tsim Sha Tsui. And this poem, I mean, it merely reflects my wish that there is such a metro station or metro line connecting all my favorite places, and to kind of see the map that I'm holding. It may be the tube map, but it may be another map. Or I also find it like, which is why I actually really love this quote from Szymborska about map. The poem is called Map. And it's called In the East and West, above and below the equator, quiet like pins dropping, and in every black pinprick, people keep on living. And I think to us all, like there's, as Sonia says, like there's a universality. It's like looking for universality in places is really important. But in order to do that, in order to kind of evoke my own, like kind of bring back my own memories and make the connecting dots, and also to sort of recreate places, I find it really important to do some research that kind of like bring me to that place imaginatively again and again. And I think I particularly, for example, there's a poem about Project Hope schools in China, which I feel very strongly about that, not only because I have been to China a couple of times to these village schools, and actually there was a year when I was invited to like, would you like to stay in China and be a teacher to teach all these village schools and so on, set up charity projects. And back then I wasn't it was before I did my master's, and that kind of future almost lay open to me as if that can be what I would do and stay in China and teach these kids. So in order to, obviously I didn't take that path, or that wasn't part of my journey, but I came across all these images on National Geographic, and I had to dig deep. I looked at, I watched lots of documentaries about these village schools and how these children in China, they had to climb a mountain for 2 hours in order to get to a classroom, that unnamed classroom, and sit down and read books, and there are not enough textbooks. And so I think, to me, like it's kind of research, imagination, and putting together a collage, and also like sometimes maybe like envisioning or reimagining the past is also really important to me.
How much would you, well, both of you, how much would you sacrifice in terms of accuracy for the sake of the prose, or for the sake of the line of poetry?
I would say like it's really hard to pin it down. I suppose a lot of what I write about, I care quite a lot about the sense of authenticity, but it might be a sense of like more like emotional authenticity, and also purpose. So as you say, like for example, sometimes I would use prose poetry to kind of reflect that sort of story, like to kind of enable more of a storytelling. I would say that, for example, even in, let's say, the example of small school about this village school in China, it wouldn't, I don't know if they have actually a piano there that they can play with, but if imagination can bring you there.
Yeah.
And I suppose also to be as visual as possible is, you know, as Sonia mentioned about this emotional geography and, you know, kind of bringing back all these sights and sounds that feel authentic, and to kind of also put the people's stories in the forefront. I think that will really help people to sort of read into that. But at the same time, I suppose I also wanted to kind of make it in a way the absence of certain things, like I tend to want to leave or conjure a gap in between the lines and in between the stories, so that you know that it's an incomplete story somehow.
Yeah. Sonia, what about you? Do you is there something you would sacrifice for the sake of the story? In terms
You
of
know, no, definitely not intentionally. because you know, I mean, I think when even with fiction, it's one thing to decide to world build. For instance, in Unmarriageable, I wanted to mirror Austen's small town Meryton, where Pride and Prejudice takes place mostly, and so I decided to give myself the liberty of an fictitious small town. I made it up.
Yeah.
So I completely world built this little small town of Dalipabad, and I made a map, and I made roads, and I made you know, and I made a linear map, and I made a concentric map, and it was a lot of fun to go into to world build like that architecturally, a complete city, and see who lives where and who whatever, and also the liberty of that is, you know, never being told that, well, you got that traffic light wrong over there. But you know, and it was an amalgamation of a lot of small towns that I've seen in Pakistan or elsewhere. So there's that imagination that comes into play. You'd mentioned Afghanistan in an isolated incident, and you know, it took me 10 years to write that book, and I think a lot of it was because an isolated incident is complete imagination. It is not. The plot has nothing to do with my life at all in any way, shape, or form. So you know, so geographically, because it takes place over so many different countries and terrains that I haven't visited. You mentioned the terrorist camp in Afghanistan, and one of the themes running through the novel, I mean, this is a pre 9/11 novel, so you know, one of the themes very much is freedom fighting, terrorism, what it means, what it doesn't mean, who it means what to. You know, I remember growing up reading a lot about the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, and you know, and the IRA when I was growing up in England, and these things, I guess, stayed with me because one people had a different way of looking at it, another people had a different way of looking at it, and there was no right or wrong per se, and that always fascinated me. But I think the way the world has come about, the right or the wrong of it has become, on the one hand, murkier, on the other hand, clearer. And this is something I wanted to explore through my 19-year-old Billy's journey. But you know, Afghanistan, especially where he ends up, is not somewhere where I wanted to go for research, and also where I have to say, just by dint of gender, being a woman, it's not somewhere where I think I could have traipsed in, perhaps like a male writer may have been able to if he so chose. And I bring that back to in Lahore, back in the day when I used to smoke, I could not go outside. You know, I could maybe borrow a smoke from my driver or you know, or someone as those societies are set up, but I could not hang out with him at the gate having smoking cigarette. My brother, on the other hand, very much could do that because it was a male space. So you know, those little in between nuances of what is allowed, what is not allowed geographically, who can stand close to whom. You know, if my brother put his arm around the male driver, one of the male domestic help, that would be fine, but I could never think of doing that. And by dint of that, that closure of space allowed them to share a lot of their life with him too, which they might not necessarily share with me out of respect, out for gender, whatever. So when I was creating that Afghanistan, that geographical space, I had to be very cognizant of the gender I was writing in and how I was going to present that gender, because I had to put myself in not just a male gender, but Billy's age, Billy's space. It was quite hard. So for me, the geographical journey of writing is sometimes easier because you can find a lot of research, you know, especially nowadays online. When I first started writing Unmarriageable, there was very little about Afghanistan and camps and whatnot. Now there's a lot. But back then I really had to use, for instance, the hardest challenge for me was I was like, where do they go to the bathroom? Where could they possibly go? And then I remembered a school trip I'd taken in high school to Balochistan, one of Pakistan's provinces, from Punjab into Balochistan. And we were visiting a quarry and someone had to go to the bathroom and they went between rocks. And I was like, okay, so, you know, that's how you connect your memories, your experiences. And if you don't have those experiences, really you imagine it. I mean, where would you go? Put yourself in that space. But for me, the harder journeys really were the emotional journeys of emotional placement and how the characters would feel. And for that research really, that is a research in itself too. But I think that research comes from within yourself. You really have to dig into some very interesting spaces, let me say, depending on the stories you're telling. I mean, Zari's story is one which is pretty harrowing. You know, I mean, she goes through that horrific thing in the beginning. I thank the universe have, you know, and I would wish that on my, you know, on anyone, but I had to put myself in her shoes, like all of us writers do, and go through those emotions. And it was very hard to do that. But then to combine the landscape research, if I haven't visited a country, with the emotional research, if I haven't personally lived through that experience, it's almost the same thing in a way. You know, you have to just have a gut feeling for what is right and what is not, and then meld those two together. So research in both ways. And
so
yes,
the research, yes, it is very much going into yourself, isn't it? And you know, that's in a sense what imaginative literature, writing it, is all about. It just makes me wonder how our present situation, where our spaces are changing, or the nature of our spaces is changing. What does that do to you as a writer? Does it make any difference? Is it all the same? Just as you couldn't go to Afghanistan, you can't go to a lot of places now. You're, you know, well, you were saying earlier, actually, before we started, you're not quite in lockdown over there, but it's a different interpretation, put it that way. But the nature of space that we inhabit is changing. Does that affect your writing, or are you thinking about that, or is it not?
You know, I think it does affect your writing in many ways. I mean, on the one hand, to put it in a bright light, it once again puts a writer or me in a different space and situation, one I never thought I'd ever be in, which is, you know, a worldwide event, which all of sometimes I get locked into a certain mind frame, and then a change of perspective from a room changes me. So even the internal geography of my house and how big that house is, or how small that house is, or what rooms are open in that house can change the view of and perspective of your writing also. So space in many respects is very, very important, especially, I mean, I have to say, growing up in a country like Pakistan, even, you know, and as a woman, your public space can often be very constricted also. You know, I mean, me personally, when I was growing up, would wear sleeveless. And I'm not a petite person. Not that that should matter, but I think it matters to some people. You know, I'm a heavy person. I'm very comfortable with it, very happy with being stocky, short, squat. It comes up in an Unmarriageable. Body image, body positivity, being shamed for looking a certain way is a huge theme in Unmarriageable. But, you know, growing up in Pakistan, I would go to the bazaars, I would go to the stores wearing my sleeveless. I'm not a dupatta person per se, you know, but it would be amazing to me how across the social class, everyone felt they had the right to police me. If I went into a shoe store, the man, and it's very much a male space with shops in the late 80s, early 90s, you know, they would feel it their right to say, Baji, you know, they would say it in Urdu, but they'd say, Baji, you need to cover up your arms, you know, you don't need to do this. And they would be saying it from a moral point of view. And then you would bump into some, you know, society dame on the same street, and she'd say, really, darling, you need to cover up those arms. They're looking a bit heavy. And, so it was the same sentiment of cover yourself up, girl, but it was coming from a different perspective. And sometimes the morality would be there with the societal stuff also. And I brought a lot of that into Unmarriageable, for sure. I mean, the novel is about public space and who gets to be an individual, what does community mean? But same with an isolated incident also, who gets to live, depending on the country, like I always say, depending on the country you're born in, the class you're born into, and then the family you find yourself into, that will determine oftentimes the choices and the life you end up leading. And then what we do with that, whether we rebel, whether we accept that, depends on our individual psyches. And all my work actually is about that, and both the novel, because they're very different novels. One is about terrorism, one is about conflict, and the other one is Pride and Prejudice. But thematically, the universalities in both echo, for sure.
Jenny, are you still there?
Yes,
Okay.
I'm still.
Right. No, there was a thing about somebody had a bit of trouble with the internet. Space, and I was just thinking about writing space and you as well. I mean, I know, among writers, there's some writers, I mean, they're popular ideas, isn't it, that writers have their own solitude, they like their solitude and so on. But a lot of writers who actually don't want solitude, they have to go out of the house to write. A couple of students I know who were saying to me how actually, they always go to a cafe to write or a library to write. Now they can't do that, and it's driving them crazy, as it were. It's really difficult to cope with that. There's also people who have been used to having their kind of sacred writing space, which is now suddenly invaded by everybody else working at home, and indeed, what we're doing now, where suddenly, the festivals that you might go to are coming in through your front door, as it were. How does that work for you as a writer?
I think it's got many dimensions, positive and negative included. So for the initial, initial two weeks or so after the pandemic was announced, I feel like it was quite a disappointing time for a writer. I mean, maybe especially I had only launched my book. There were lots of events lined up, and the kind of idea that you couldn't go to your own events and not being able to meet fellow writers to talk about it. Or to have dialogues and so on, that can be quite disappointing. But on the other hand, realizing that events like these can continue to happen, and that we can still carry on conversation, you can carry on reading and writing activities, and people are still actually more than ever really need the solace from books and reading literature. And I felt really encouraged by that. And to be honest, at first I was very claustrophobic. I felt like, I used to write almost entirely in coffee shops.
All right, so you're one of the outside writers.
Uncomfortable, yeah. I mean, people kept telling me, "Oh, why can't you write in library or at your home?" But I felt like, it's a different sort of space. We were talking about space. It's like when you feel a lot more kind of anonymous, or at least feel more comfortable being part of the community and hearing in the background other people carrying on with their lives. Somehow that is very important to me. And for a long time I talked to my husband that he liked to go to somewhere where there's nobody around, whereas I would like to travel where there are people around in the landscape.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that sort of sense of community can be lost almost in a way. But I feel like more and more I begin to embrace technology a bit more. And also the fact is closer than people are still closer to you than ever, because it's just like now what we're doing, It doesn't mean that we are living in a different home, actually people cannot communicate. So for me, I think that's one of the advantages, that you can also have your sense of calm and being able to go back to the books and keep writing, being a sort of motivation for me. I think at the same time, because I've always reflected on diasporic spaces, I think for now, like it's very surreal and yet kind of productive at the same time. And I think, like, for example, one of my friends, Nina, who published my pamphlet, she runs Bitter Melon Poetry, and she has this stay home diary, which archive, for example, Asian writers' responses to the pandemic and so on.
Right.
And I've written, like a short piece along with the other writers about, my feelings during the pandemic and how it feels like, like waiting for the world to recover, this sense of feeling. Which is sort of interesting and also encouraging in some sense that we share something in common, and that I can still carry on conversations with people in Asia and so on. And I think it is a matter of trying to really know our place in the world, and also how we kind of navigate between different states of being, and at the same time, how do we connect with each other? And I felt also on another dimension is that, for example, as a teacher, at first, the sense of being, of not seeing your students face to face can be really bizarre. And it felt like immediately that sense of identity is lost. But now that in most universities or most colleges, they continue in online teaching in some form, and that is quite, the other day I was having a Zoom workshop with some students, and I felt like it's really still like humanity. It's like talking and writing about humanity that really matters.
Yeah, Sonia, you've done lots of online events before the lockdown, and I just wondered, what does it feel like now? Is there a difference, like what we're doing now, this kind of conversation, and whether having this sort of event where we're not quite interacting with the audience, does that make a difference?
It's an interesting. I have done some online events beforehand, but Unmanageable came out last year in January, and I was on my paperback tour for it. It came out in February. And I've been doing festivals and bookstores and classrooms and all sorts of events, more than any online events per se. And what I really did not realize, and what the lockdown has absolutely made me realize, is that for me at least, the interaction that you have with a live audience, with people in front of you. I mean, I think there's some events that I've been doing on various platforms where you can see the audience, or there's still some interaction. But when you're in front of people, there's a dialogue, silent, even if it's silent, even if that dialogue is silent, even if those connections are silent between you and the people listening to you, there's body language, there's facial, people are laughing, you pause for everyone to laugh, you laugh yourself, there's those silent cues, and they're all the body language interactions going on, which obviously are very much lost. Like right now, we don't know we don't know who will watch this, who won't watch this, whether they'll chuckle, whether they'll nod their head in agreement, whether they will say, oh no, that's not the way it was for me. So those little things which you have with an audience, which are part of, I think, being a writer, part of seeing, you write in isolation, of course, and then you have your editors and everything, and you get interaction, but to have reader interaction, to have someone sitting in the audience nodding along to what you're saying, or laughing at something you didn't think was funny, but they thought was funny. It's just a different sort of dialogue, and one which is very enriching, I think. So I definitely think for me, this situation, though very blessed that we're able to even have these things, technology has allowed us at this point in time to be able to still communicate. And I'm watching so much more stuff because so many festivals, so many things have shifted online. There's a plethora, wealth of being able to listen to different authors from different countries, regions, etc., which perhaps wasn't really available before this. Nevertheless, that interaction is something that I find very enriching, and I think is lost between this. But there are other things that are found, which is there's a lot more, I think people will be a lot more comfortable with these sort of events also, and tuning in. I mean, I have to say personally, I'm a little bit of a, technology often phases me. So, I'm on Instagram and I love my Instagram, but I was very scared about, I'll use the word scared. I was like, what is this Instagram live thing? Like, what will happen? Like, who, and then I was doing a Jane Austen conference, virtual conference, and I had a talk to give. And really all you do is you press the button and you're live. And it's not that scary after all.
So in a way, we're going in two directions, aren't we? On the one hand, we're going back to the Jane Austen era, if you like, where your interaction with your readers was there's a huge time lag. And for many, many writers in history, the time lag was so long that they didn't actually get to see it.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we're moving very far ahead as well, where we do have this amazing ability to connect across geography and time.
Absolutely, yes. And I think the interesting thing is that there are different timelines with everything, and technology timeline is its own fascinating beast, because I think in some respects technology time versus human emotional time are running on two different trajectories. Technology is developing so fast, and I don't know if humans are able to keep up with it, because on the one hand, technology has given us globally the ability to connect and see ourselves as the human species. On the other hand, unfortunately, it seems to me that emotionally, more and more people are sort of not being comfortable with that and are shying away from the connectivity that technology is able to afford us. So there are a lot of, a lot of paradoxes within what technology affords us and what we don't choose to purchase, or some of us don't choose to purchase.
I think it's good that you mentioned the two timelines, because they're sort of converging at the moment as we are coming to the end of our time on this particular event. But I don't want to kind of finish without one last question to both of you, actually, which you like you to just say briefly even. Jenny, in one of her poems, I think it's a poem called Trace, has a line where someone asks a question and the response is, I miss nothing, speaking about the place that she's left. And then the poem goes on to demonstrate just how much she misses practically everything, as it were. So for both of you, really, what do you miss most? And take that in any way you want to go, as a result of the lockdown or just as a result of your own relocations in life. Is there something that you miss? Jenny, do you want to start?
I think thanks for mentioning Trace. And I think, like in both Trace and Metamorphosis, I think I dealt with it about the things that I miss most. It's not so much about food or like particular places and so on. It's more about like the sort of sense of community, sense of being in that community, living the presence, and also the sense that in particular for Hong Kong, like the sense that a certain sort of history or a certain way of living has been gradually changing, I would say. And that for me is about bearing witness to that space of change in space and in the people's stories and experiences that matters. I think in Metamorphosis in particular, I dealt with that, like this slow changing scene, because even though that we thought that it is potentially always a place that you can go back to, that home is always a place that you can go back to, in reality, home is also changing. And how do you deal with that? And how do you embrace that and at the same time resist that? What can you do? What can you do to keep that, preserve it, as it were, in your world?
Great. Okay. And Sonia, what do you miss?
What do I miss? The way my life has played out, it's often been a question of how not to miss, and what to absorb from different places. I mean, I will say on a very basic level, I think what I perhaps miss, but then perhaps we all as adults miss that, which is when you're feeling scared about something or uncertain. And if you're blessed enough to have, if you're able to lie between your parents, whether they can protect you or not, that bridge of safety which loved ones can provide you, be it parents, be it family, be it even friends, just being able to. But for me, my parents, being able to, I remember when I was young and there'd be thunder or storm and I'd go running to their bedroom and lie between them, and then it wouldn't really matter. It was as if they, whether they could or not. As an adult, I would, I'd re-wonder. But also that for me, I've lived in so many different places, and the one universal, the one, it's nature. And I'm not really a nature person. I'm not a sunset sunrise person, but it's the texture of sunshine, and it's the way the rain sounds in different places and smells in different places, and to recreate that. Like sometimes if you close your eyes and you're hearing rain in Georgia and it's falling through my wooden deck onto the stone steps, I swear it sounds like monsoon in Pakistan or India. And and same with sunshine. Sometimes you close your eyes and the way it falls on your skin, it's back to being in that hot Saudi Arabia, of my childhood. And then suddenly I'm emotionally connected back to those spaces, to those memories, to those everything. So I would say, because my whole life has been one of how not to miss a space, because I didn't get to choose whether I wanted to be rooted in one city, one town, and grow up. I moved from place to place to place, and now I'm very familiar with moving it. And people say rootlessness and whatnot. There is a rootedness in rootlessness too. There is a home in being a nomad also. But for me, very much, the sunshine, the sound of rain. And I've grown up partly in England also. People complain about gray days. I happen to love my gray days. It's perfect for tea and samosas or pakoras, so I bring all my different cultures. I bring all my different ways of growing up, the different books, the different movies, the different everything. And I'm just able to make a nice little nest, different things of them. So yeah, I think humans, we all miss the same thing. And I think the hardest thing is when people move on. It's when loved ones, you move on, when they pass, when they die. There's no bigger missing than that, rather than geography. It's the emotional missing for me. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And when you mentioned the rain, I don't know whether you heard, but the rain was coming down like a monsoon halfway through.
No, we couldn't hear it.
Session.
I will tell you, it's raining in Georgia today too. So UK.
Well,
and
it's raining in London as well. Thank you so much, Soniah Kamal and Jennifer Wong. Thank you so much for joining us, and to everyone at home for joining BookBound 2020 for this event. There are lots and lots of great events like this on the program. Search for BookBound 2020 on Twitter, Instagram, as Sonia was saying, to learn more. Help spread the word, and use the hashtag BookBound 2020. If any of you want to buy, hold on, I haven't finished because we've got to do this one. If anybody wants to buy any books of either of our authors, and I think you really, really should, you won't regret it. And this is a perfect time to get into these books. The links in the text below this video will take you through to Hive, an online bookseller which supports independent bookshops. Links to books discussed are also there, discount codes, festival titles. You'll also find our authors' favorite independent bookshops across the globe as well. You'll find the Just Giving link to donate to our chosen charity supporting mental health, Mind. And all that remains is for me to say thank you again to all of you, and especially to Jenny and to Sonia, and goodbye.